Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant. Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. This will not, you may continue with direct examination. Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant.
Ask you a few questions. We've discussed some of your credentials and your background. We've discussed some of your credentials and your background. Different types of organizations. Have you had an opportunity to head up organizations? Have you had an opportunity to head up or different types of national organizations? Or oversee different types of national organizations?
Yes, ma'am.
What kinds of those?
I was one of the co-founders, and then I was one of the co-founders, and then president of the Trauma Psychology Division of the American Psychological Association. So you go from like president-elect, president, past president.
Okay.
I was in that position for a while. I headed up a variety of national committees, state committees, especially when I was in Texas for quite some time. And then currently I'm involved in two major national organizations. I'm the co-chair of the National Partnership to End Interpersonal Violence across the lifespan. And the way this country deals with all types of interpersonal violence, from child abuse to domestic violence to sexual assault to elder abuse across the lifespan. So I co-chair that group. And then I also am now the president of the American Academy of Couple and Family Psychology, which is a national organization that's also tied into the board certifications in family psychology.
Okay. And these, you're telling us these are national organizations?
Yes, ma'am.
So they're more than just what you deal with in California?
Yes, that is correct.
With regard to this case, had you ever been retained to work on a case of mine before?
No, ma'am.
How about Mr. Nerman?
No, ma'am.
Have you ever met Miss Arias?
No, ma'am.
What about, have you ever worked with Mr. Martinez?
No, ma'am.
Do you know or have you met Dr. DeMarte?
No, ma'am.
And what about Alice LaViolette? Have you ever met her?
Yes.
And do you know Miss LaViolette?
Yes, I do.
How do you know her?
When I relocated to California, well, I knew of her because of a book she had co-authored with a colleague of mine. I think I first met her when I moved to California. We put on, as I mentioned, that international conference, and she was one of the people that the planning committee selected to speak. I think that's where I first met her. And then after that, we're involved in an organization. I think she's involved actually in the partnership representing another organization. She co-chaired the Association for Batter Intervention Programs in the state of California, and I chair the research committee from that organization. She's presented at the conference we put on from time to time. I've trained at, I think, some of her conferences. I believe I know of, or recall one article that she has published in one of the journals that I edit. We did a special issue about 6, 7 years ago. I don't actually remember. I'd have to look at my Vita.
Okay.
On domestic violence offenders, looking at national policies. And we had about 16, 18 different articles that was published in a double issue of one of the journals that later came out as a book. And she has one of those peer-reviewed articles.
Okay, and you were the editor for that article?
Co-editor, Alan Rosenbaum in Illinois was my other co-editor.
Okay. And so would you consider Ms. LaViolette a colleague of yours?
Yes.
Other than that, have you ever worked together? Do you ever team up to work together?
Other than training, no. I mean, we never dealt with clients together. I think she's referred cases to me from time to time. I've referred cases to her from time to time, especially because I live in San Diego. She lives in the Long Beach area. So we're probably about an hour and a half away from each other. I don't recall working on any cases with her or where she was involved or anything along those lines.
All right, and with regard to this case, in preparing for this case, did you review anybody's testimony?
No, ma'am.
And did you watch anybody's testimony?
No, ma'am.
Other than what you and I have discussed, are you aware of what Ms. LaViolette testified to?
No.
And actually, did we ever discuss Ms. LaViolette's testimony?
No specifics that I'm aware of.
Okay. And did we mainly discuss Dr. DeMarte?
Yes, I believe a little bit about Dr. Samuels because he administered 2 of those tests, but I don't know what he testified to, and I'm not aware of anybody else.
Okay. But other than that, did you ever watch any of their testimony or read it?
No.
So are you aware then specifically of what they've said?
No, I am not.
You've been practicing for about how long now?
My first license was over 35 years ago. I was a marriage and family counselor in California.
All right. So during the time that you have been practicing and during that time testifying in different cases, were you aware that superior courts or appellate courts have had occasion to comment on your testimony or an aspect of your testimony in that other case?
Not at the time.
And when you say not at the time, what do you mean?
Well, I would, at various cases, come in and either as an expert or if a case I evaluated and testify, and then my role would be over. I am virtually never aware of cases that get appealed. Sometimes I don't know the outcomes of the cases, sometimes I do, but the appeals or things like that, I'm not involved in, don't know about, and usually I think maybe in all those cases somebody might have told me they were appealing one or may have gotten something, but most of the time I have no idea unless somebody specifically brings it up.
Well, and so at some point down the road, did you ever learn of any cases where appellate courts have had a comment about an aspect of your testimony?
Yes.
And how did you learn that?
It was actually in another court case where an attorney was trying to impeach me and brought up these cases of which, I mean, I knew, I think it was 4 or 5 or half dozen. A couple of them I remembered the names. Some of these went back 25 years. But the details I really didn't know. And so they were asking me questions and I really couldn't say, and then they would read what an appellate court had said, and I guess basically to try to impeach me. I mean, those cases, they were mostly deemed by those judges when this happened as not relevant to what I was doing then. Subsequent to that, somebody did go back and trace those cases.
Did you get more of an understanding of what those cases were later on?
Some of them, some I couldn't remember what they had cited. Again, that's in the legal arena, and I don't have access to necessarily checking legal citations, but another attorney did check those.
Okay, and what we're talking about is right now, would you agree that we're in a superior court, a trial court, right?
Yes, I actually didn't know it was titled Superior Court. Okay. Different states, different jurisdictions used different titles, so I didn't know what this one was.
All right, and what we're talking about with these opinions from other judges, are we talking about in appellate courts, courts above this one?
That is correct.
So when appellate courts are reviewing, you are no longer involved in that case, is that right?
Yes, in fact, some of those were like 5, 10 years later.
Okay, that the appellate opinions come out.
Evidently.
And any of these cases with regard to these appellate opinions that make a comment about an aspect of your testimony, is there anything about these that commented that you did anything unethical?
No, ma'am.
What about any comments with regard to being disciplined?
No.
And did any of these comments ever lead to anything like you were disciplined?
Oh, no.
And what about, was there at any point where you were not allowed to testify, where you were not qualified to testify?
No, even in those cases, my credentials were accepted. Most of those cases, there was something.
So were you allowed to testify in those cases?
Yes, in all those cases, I was allowed to testify, but not necessarily about a particular thing. In some of the cases, the appellate court, like struck, I guess is the legal term, part of it because they said technically or legally I couldn't say certain things.
And did that have to do with a legal matter, not having to do with your qualifications?
Sustained.
At some point in time, did you learn about these opinions?
Yes,
As
ma'am.
we've discussed. And so based on what you've learned about these opinions, did you learn that these comments are made about a legal aspect versus an aspect of your expertise?
Yes, that is correct. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh.
You can answer.
Yes, that is what I was told by the other attorneys who reviewed them.
Okay, that these were legal aspects.
Yes, different technicalities or legal things or something that an appeal court then made a specific ruling about. Not my overall testimony, but about particular parts of it.
Okay, and not about your expertise?
No, that was not challenged.
All right. We talked a little bit earlier about you having a diplomate in neuropsychology, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
What is neuropsychology?
Neuropsychology is the bridge between psychology and medicine. So in psychology, it's a science of the study of human behavior and all the things that go into that. In medicine, neurology is a study of the nervous system, the central nervous system, and the brain from a medical standpoint. Neuropsychology bridges those two, and it basically is the study of how the brain affects behavior and how those are interacting. That's the realm of neuropsychologists.
And so a neuropsychologist then would specialize in what? What does a neuropsychologist do?
They would do usually one of three things. Actually, what we would call neuropsychological tests. So if somebody wanted to know whether or not they had some type of impairment in some part of their brain, a neuropsychologist, assuming we're not talking about a fracture, but would be the one to do that. So evaluation of the different ways the brain affects behavior and functioning would be up to a neuropsychologist. So evaluation is one part. Treatment would be another. So if we discovered that somebody had particular parts of their brain that weren't functioning quite right due to an injury, a stroke, an illness, or closed head injury, then the neuropsychologists or the people they work with would structure what would be called the cognitive rehabilitation. It would be the program in treating that person to help them regain functioning, and either outpatient, outside the hospital in your own clinic, or in some kind of clinical setting. It would be developing the program to do that and perhaps actually doing it. We can't change the brain itself, but what neuropsychologists do is figure out how to use parts of your brain that are working right to help compensate for whatever isn't working right. And the third would be training education about what neuropsychology is, what we know about the brain. That would be another component of that.
So based on that, then, are neuropsychologists taught and trained specifically about what the brain functions do? What parts of the brain do what?
Yes, and how to evaluate the different parts of the brain to look for impairment in the different areas of the brain and how that would impact the person, him or herself. So what part of the brain might be impacted that would affect certain behaviors. That would all come under the purview of a neuropsychologist.
All right. Can you tell me, since you have a diplomate, and we discussed it earlier, tell me what kind of specialized training that you have then with neuropsychology.
Neuropsychology is actually one of my earlier specializations. I was trained in my pre-doctorate years in dealing with learning disabilities in children mostly or adolescents, attention deficit disorder, et cetera, and had done some research on that. And then after I received my doctorate and became an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Tyler, I was the one in the department charged with developing our assessment protocols. So I ended up going to quite a few trainings. Some were 1 week long, some 2 in different parts of the country. In fact, one of them was here in Arizona, and the other was in Nebraska, to learn the different techniques in assessment so that I could bring it back and develop those at the university. And then ended up going to quite a few workshops on the brain, on neuropsychology, what the research was, et cetera. And so it was probably about the mid-1980s, after having done this for over 5 years, that I applied for that first board certification, the first diplomate, which I believe was awarded sometime in the mid-1980s, and then have continued that ever since. So,
how do you continue that?
well, two ways. One is, as I mentioned before, I set up the courses at the university in Texas to train our graduate students in how to do these assessments. How do you actually assess for brain functioning, and how do you find out how that's impacted on the person? So one was there. The other is I had a large private practice mental health clinic that one of three that I had created and built that I oversaw. And we actually did the work in that clinic. We had a clinical staff of about 13 psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, MFTs. So we actually had a whole part of our operation that conducted neuropsychological evaluations for the local hospitals and clinics and others. So if somebody either had or was suspected of having a learning disability or a head injury or a concussion or a stroke or anything that impacted the brain, then often the referral would come to us. We would evaluate that person and then make recommendations about treatment, rehabilitation. And then we also had part of our clinic that actually did the outpatient rehab. So that started then, and it's continued. So we still train people, even now, though I'm here now, in neuropsychological evaluations, how that connects to trauma, what happens in the brain, how to do those assessments, and from time to time we're still asked to do those types of evaluations.
Okay, and have you ever, we talked earlier about peer review and publishing. Have you ever had any publications with regard to neuropsychology?
Yes.
Could you tell us what those are, or do you need to look at your Vita?
One was some were dealing with learning disabilities and looking at that in school children, which was early on. Another one was focused on neuropsychological assessment, and another one was on research we had actually conducted. We had actually conducted neuropsychological and what's called quantitative EEGs. It's a way to measure how the brain responds to different things going on in the person's life. So we actually had a research study comparing domestic violence offenders to people who were referred for head injuries to people who didn't have either, and that was published in '97. And then we are currently now putting together the entire database of all the capital cases where we did neuropsychological assessments over about a 15-year period.
What does that involve?
Well, it meant that we went in and actually conducted full neuropsych evals of capital offenders in 8 states.
Judge, may we approach? So besides becoming a diplomate in neuropsychology a long time ago, are you currently involved in neuropsychology?
Yes.
Okay. And are you currently involved in studies with regard to neuropsychology?
Yes.
Okay. So does that keep you up to date then?
Yes.
Okay. And so based on that information, do you have a very good understanding of the different parts of the brain and how it works?
I would say yes. There are probably very specific things that I probably don't remember anymore, but in general, yes, we still do the training to people on how that's connected to other things even now.
Okay. And you're obviously familiar with the physiology of the brain, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And in your practice, have you specifically dealt with brain injuries?
Yes, I have.
have you evaluated, you've told us that you've evaluated people with injuries. Have you ever had an occasion to have people with frontal lobe injuries?
Yes.
And have you treated people with frontal lobe injuries?
Yes.
And specifically, do you recall about how many?
Well, frontal lobe injuries, in the broad perspective, would be quite a few, because often closed head injuries or concussions cause damage to the frontal areas of the brain. So we've worked with that quite often. The different types, we've had occasional times where, I couldn't tell you how many, but where somebody had a stroke or a hemorrhage or something that also affect frontal lobe, temporal lobe, other areas of the brain. And then we've had a few cases that are called projectile, where something penetrated the brain, and a few others where the skull penetrated the brain. So over time, we've had quite a few different types of cases.
Okay, let's talk about the projectile.
Yes,
penetrating the brain, not the skull itself, but a projectile. Have you had specific cases that you have worked on with regard to that?
Yes, ma'am.
And about, when we're talking about projectiles and not being knocked out by a skull fracture, so we're talking about specifically projectiles, do you remember the projectiles that you worked with?
There were two that I can recall.
Okay.
One was, or two cases were bullets, and one was a nail from a nail gun.
From a nail gun, okay. And in these three particular cases, are we talking specifically about the frontal lobe?
Yes.
Okay. I'm showing you what's been already in evidence as Exhibit 529. From this picture, can you tell us where the frontal lobe is?
Yes. From this one, it would be, whoops, let me just look a second. Can't tell if we're looking at the front or the side view. Broken. Yes, it would be on the left side of the picture.
Can
it would be over this area. The frontal lobe would be this area in here, would be the frontal lobe of this person's brain. I can't tell if it's right or left side, but that would be the frontal lobe.
Okay. All right. And when we're talking about frontal lobe, does it matter whether it's right or left side?
Yes.
Okay. How does it matter?
Well, if it's the right side of the brain, especially if you're especially if you're talking about, say, motor skills or sensory skills, which would occur more in this area, the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. So the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. So that's why if you hear somebody who, for example, had a stroke in the left side of the brain in the parietal or motor area, then they may become paralyzed, their right arm or right leg or both. Or if it's on the left side, similar. Or if they've had a stroke, say, right in this area, which is sort of on the lower side of the frontal approaching the temporal region, you can see this particular diagram talks about the Broca's area. The Broca's area there is speech. So somebody who has damage to that area of the brain on the left side would mean they might have significant difficulty in speech. It could be anywhere from not being able to talk to saying the wrong things or not being able to literally form the words. If it was below that on the left side, it could mean that they could speak, but they may not understand language or words. It's on the right side, it wouldn't affect speech, it would affect some other function. So each part of the brain affects different things we do, from our way we perceive, hear, see, touch, motor skills, thinking, reasoning. Everything we do comes from basically the brain, except for breathing or what we call autonomic things. Breathing, sleeping, things like that are controlled more with other parts of the brain.
Okay, and so we're clear. What you're telling us then is that on the left side of the brain is where we talk about speech, is what controls speech.
Well, left side of the brain in a particular area, correct.
Right, and so that particular area, can you, this picture isn't particularly good to show us, but as generally speaking, where, if you're looking at your own head, where on the left-hand side of the brain are we talking about speech?
Well, I'll do both. In this particular diagram, it would be right in here.
Okay.
In what that does on the actual brain would be sort of inside the brain, sort of behind the eye, about in that area, but inside. See, this is inside the brain. It's not on the outside of that area, it's inside. Depending on the size of the head, the skull, and brain, it would be at least a few inches inside.
Okay, so inside the brain on the left-hand side.
Yes.
Okay. And that's where we talk about, that's where speech is.
That's correct.
Okay. And what about...
Well, I need to clarify a little bit.
Sure.
I mean, that's generally where speech is, but
Okay.
theoretically, certain damage to the motor skills could mean that you might be able to speak, but you can't actually control, say, the muscles or the motor parts of speaking. But you would know how to do it, but you couldn't do it. This actually means that you can't speak, not because there's a problem with your motor skills. It's really more of a problem with the way the brain is.
Okay, so motor skills, let's talk about motor skills. Where do we get those from in the brain?
In this particular drawing, it would be in this region in here. It's called the frontal parietal lobe. It has particular names because toward the frontal side here is the motor skills. Behind it is more of the sensory. So everybody listening to me now, that would be here, this perceiving what I'm saying is more in the sensory region. Me actually talking would also be, and moving, would come more from the motor skills. And then again, the right and the left side. But that's sort of in the, when you're looking at the brain, sort of in the center of the brain, inside, is probably the best way I can describe it. So you can see if this is the front of the skull, if this is the front of the head, then you're talking about pretty well up and in.
So up and inside the brain.
Correct.
Anything to do with the frontal lobe?
Pardon?
Does it have anything to do with the frontal lobe?
Well, all the brain is interconnected, so it's not like everything works in isolation. So yes, the frontal lobe is involved, but it's not really, the frontal lobe doesn't focus on motor skills, but let's say you want to do a very complex motor skill, like a sport event or something that required skills. That would likely involve both the frontal lobes and the sensory motor cortex. So the motor skills part would come out of the motor cortex, but being able to plan and develop those skills would come out of the frontal lobe as well. So they work together. The brain is a very impressive, unique thing in the way everything does interconnect. There are millions of neural pathways that go all the way through the brain and connect all sorts of different things, which is why then the neuropsychologist tries to figure out what's going on, where in the brain it is, and then what can we do.
Okay. When we talk, is there anything, when we look inside a skull, and and you're looking at a brain, is there anything in between the skull and the brain?
Yes.
What's in between?
There are membranes, 3 actually. One is called the dura mater, which is on the outside here. So the skull would essentially be, all around here on the outside, and then in between that and the brain itself are membranes. Dura mater is one of the ones that is inside there, and it surrounds the brain. So in some respects, it protects the brain, because essentially the brain is not rigidly in your head. It sort of floats and does other things. So these all sort of protect it.
One of the membranes, the dura mater, you said?
Yes.
And is that something that completely surrounds the brain?
Yes.
And in particular, is it something that is surrounding the frontal lobe of the brain?
Yes. So in this drawing here, I mean, it would go all around here.
Okay. And as a part of this case, did you have a chance to review the medical examiner's report?
Yes, ma'am.
And that was Dr. Horn?
I believe so.
Okay. And in reviewing his report, he talks about Mr. Alexander's brain that he's examining, right?
Yes.
All right. And so when you're talking about people's brains, I want to go back to the people that you specifically worked with, your 2 gunshot wounds and the nail gun.
Yes.
Okay. The 2 gunshot wounds, can we talk about, do you remember where those gunshots went into those particular patients?
More or less.
Okay. Well,
I don't think I can tell you exact, but more or less.
right. Well, which part of the brain?
It was frontal lobe,
Frontal lobe injury?
One was from down up, a suicide attempt, and a bullet went this way.
Okay.
The other was I believe an accidental shooting or something, and the brain went, oh, well, this doesn't show, from the side through.
Do you know which side?
No, I couldn't tell you if it went from left to right or right to left, but I think it went completely through.
Okay, so in and then out.
Yes.
Okay. And in both of those cases, did you have a chance to see those patients at some point?
Yes.
And were you familiar with their cases?
At
Familiar with their medical history from the gunshot wound?
Yes.
And in those particular cases, were those people incapacitated because of a gunshot wound to their frontal lobe?
No.
What can you tell us about incapacitation with regard to gunshot wounds or injuries to the frontal lobe? Projectile injuries.
Well, first, incapacitation in the technical sense is usually referred to as somebody who has an inability to move arms and legs. They may or may not be conscious, but even if they're conscious, they couldn't do that. That's generally what we mean by incapacitation.
Okay, and so with these patients that you specifically worked on with frontal lobe projectile injuries, were they incapacitated to a point that they could not move their arms and legs?
No. In fact, neither of those two actually lost consciousness.
Okay, and in fact, you said one of them, the bullet actually went through and through, right? In and out.
I believe both actually did, but from
both.
different angles. Neither one had the fragment left in the brain.
Okay. Oh, so the bullet went in and came out on both of them.
Correct.
Okay. And neither one of those people were incapacitated?
That is correct.
Then, in reviewing this medical examiner's report, Dr. Horn's report, I'm looking, did he talk about the gunshot to the head?
Yes.
And did he talk about where the bullet, the wound track perforated?
Yes.
And was that the anterior frontal skull?
Yes. Right side.
Near the superior orbital bone?
Yes.
Can you tell us what that means?
It means that the bullet went in essentially above the eyebrow on the right side, and it actually tells you where it shows you a picture, but it went in through the skull here. The orbital is the bone behind where your eye is, and the skull is in there. So it went in above the right eyebrow. That's what the medical examiner's report showed.
Okay. And then does he talk about how it traverses the right anterior fossa?
Yes.
What is that?
That's the area below here, sort of the crater area that the brain frontal lobe sits in, and behind the nose, essentially.
Okay. What do you mean crater area?
Well, you can see, like right here, this doesn't go all the way down to your chin or others. So there's spaces in here and other areas of the brain that's called, well, for lack of better words, called a crater area.
Okay. And are you aware that Dr. Horn's own report said that there is no gross evidence of significant intracranial hemorrhage?
Yes.
And what does that mean to you?
It means there doesn't appear to be actual damage to the brain itself.
And what about when he says that, or apparent cerebral injury?
That's again saying there's not apparent injury to the brain itself from the bullet.
Okay. And does he qualify this with talking about the fact that the brain was somewhat decomposed?
Yes, he says that as well.
Okay. Regardless of the decomposition, based on the report reading, was there any injuries noted inside the brain?
No. Oh.
Foundational 703.
Approach.
So Dr. Geffner, again, with regard to Dr. Horn's report,
Yes.
okay? Based on his own report, do we see that even Dr. Horn said there is no apparent injury to the brain?
Yes, that's one of the statements he made.
All right. When we talk about this duramater,
Yes.
okay, so this membrane that surrounds our brains, right?
Yes, ma'am?
Does Dr. Horn talk about the duramater?
Yes.
And what does he say about the duramater?
He said it was intact.
What does that mean to you?
It means that this membrane around the brain here was not penetrated or damaged in general.
And is there any possible way that you can see a projectile piercing the brain without piercing the duramater?
Not to my knowledge.
And so is the duramater such that it surrounds our brains, that if something's going to get into our brain, it has to pierce through the duramater first?
And the other two membranes there as well.
Okay. But Dr. Horn's own report notes that the duramater was intact. Is that right?
Correct.
Assuming for a second that that's a mistake and the duramater was not intact and he made a mistake, okay?
Yes, ma'am?
If the bullet did pierce through the frontal lobe and then out into the left cheek,
Yes.
we know from his report, did it go through the right side?
Right side and then downward, yes.
Downward into the left cheek, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. So the right frontal lobe, what is it that you would expect to see if there was damage to the brain, to the right frontal lobe?
Difficulty with spatial relations, in other words, being able to perhaps have depth perception or see how things fit together, non-verbally. It doesn't deal with verbal issues. The right frontal lobe talks about planning, reasoning, things like that, but mostly regarding non-verbal types of interactions. So some of the movements might be uncoordinated. You might have some disorientation, things like that are all aspects of the right frontal. You could see some issues in behavior depending on how long we wait. You could see personality changes.
Personality changes, are we talking like down the road?
Usually, I mean, you don't usually get an immediate personality change. It usually takes more time. But if you did have something in there, that's one of the things we do see, is personality changes.
Okay.
Those would be types of things that would come from right frontal lobe, depending on, again, where in the lobe it is, too.
Okay. If Dr. Horn told this jury that he believed it would be immediately incapacitating, meaning that the person would not be able to purposely lift their arm or move their leg, would you agree with that based on what you know about the brain?
Objection, lack of foundation.
Approach. You may continue.
So let me try that one again. If Dr. Horn were to tell this jury that because a bullet somehow made it past the dura without piercing it and leaving it intact and made it through the brain and out into the left cheek, the frontal lobe, if he told this jury that that would have caused immediate incapacitation where the person could not move, would you agree with that based on what you know about the brain?
not unless it produced some type of huge explosion or something in the brain that would affect all these other areas in the motor strip. It could disorient the person, it could cause some other things, but there is substantial documentation in the research about frontal lobe injuries, some even more severe than that, that do not cause incapacitation.
What kind of research are you referring to?
There's been research in both, especially in the neuropathology area, in the journals that deal with medicine and legal and neuropsych, that have studied going back into the 1990s the effects of projectile wounds like gunshots on different parts of the brain. There have been actual journal articles on what types of things lead to incapacitation, what do not, and numerous case studies reported where somebody either shot themselves or were shot by somebody else, and then how they acted afterwards. So that's been documented going back 20 years.
Okay, and based on that research, do you have an understanding then with a frontal lobe injury, what, if the projectile, you talked about if there was a big explosion. So what's your understanding, what would qualify as a big explosion?
A bullet like a hollow point or something like that that shatters, or some other kind of things that actually literally shatters and goes everywhere, or somehow blows up the brain, explodes inside the brain, something like that could cause widespread damage. But a bullet that goes through, even if it did go through, say, the frontal area here and out the other side, it would likely cause some things happening, but nothing in that part of the brain would incapacitate a person. That's not the area of the brain that does that. So there's no evidence from a report that would cause that effect unless something else happened that we don't know about.
All right, and are you aware, based on the reading of Dr. Horn's report, that he didn't find any fragments, so there's no evidence that the bullet or anything shattered into all these pieces? Are you aware of that?
Yes, I am.
And what if Dr. Horn were to talk about some kind of a shock wave that occurs? Do you know anything about that?
No. I mean, the type of shock waves that are generally dealt with in this area are something from outside, like an explosion, like now coming back from Mideast. You have all these people with IED explosions. That produces a huge shock wave, but that causes the whole brain to be impacted, and that's how you get concussions, closed head injuries. But to incapacitate somebody, most of the time we're talking about neurogenic shock is to the spinal cord or in this area, because that's also movement. If you sever the spinal cord here by a bullet or anything else, then the person essentially immediately is incapacitated and or dies. So something that went all the way through the head and severed back here, that could do it. Or you would need something to go up here. But a bullet going through one particular side and coming out, I'm not aware of how that would impact all the way into the motor strips and other areas to, quote, incapacitate. Now, it is conceivable that there's some other type of thing that happened because of this, but it wouldn't be immediate. I mean, over time, if something else ruptured, like an artery in here, and then it started hemorrhaging and eventually hit all these other areas, you'd probably see it on your medical examination report, but then that is a possibility.
Okay, and did you see any evidence of that in reviewing his report?
No, ma'am.
And you said something that would happen later?
Well, yeah, you could have long-term effects if damage is there and you have further hemorrhaging or other things, but not likely an incapacitation.
Okay. Is there anything that you have said today that in any way has attempted to diagnose Miss Arias?
No, ma'am.
Anything that you have said that has attempted to diagnose her as a battered woman?
No, ma'am.
Anything that you have said that has attempted to diagnose her as an abused woman?
No, ma'am.
PTSD?
No.
Why not?
Because I focused on the records that I was asked. That was my role. tried to explain those records. I have not evaluated her. I've not met her. I've not reviewed her case. I've not seen the testimony. I don't know the interviews of her or others. Haven't met with her myself. Those would all be necessary to do that.
To make an actual diagnosis?
That's correct.
Okay. And the tests that you have reviewed, that we've talked about today, how do you characterize those? Would you say that they're objective or subjective?
They're classified as, the ones we reviewed today are classified as objective personality tests or trauma inventories or whatever.
Okay, so if you're looking at those tests, are you looking presumably that then at objective results?
Yes, ma'am.
And based on your reading of Dr. DeMarte's report, did you review her report, by the way?
I did.
Okay, and based on the review of her report and the things that we've talked about today, do you have an opinion as to whether or not Dr. DeMarte has an adequate understanding of the tests that she administered, the MMPI and the TSI?
Yes.
What is your opinion?
Judge, lack of foundation.
Sustained.
Judge, may we approach?
Sustained.
All right, so based on your review of Dr. DeMarte's report, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And in her report, are you aware that she diagnoses Miss Arias with borderline personality?
Yes.
And that she specifically says that PTSD does not exist?
Yes.
Based on your review of that, okay, and then your review of the testing and the data that you get from these objective tests that you've looked at and we've discussed today, do you have an opinion as to whether or not Dr. DeMarte has an adequate understanding of these testing to make that type of diagnosis?
Yes.
Judge, lack of foundation.
Approach, please. You may continue.
Do I need to ask the question again, or do you remember it? Do you have an opinion with regard to whether or not Dr. DeMarte has an adequate understanding of how to administer these tests and make a diagnosis?
Yes.
Okay, what is that opinion?
The trauma symptom inventory and the MMPI are the two that she does not appear to have either an adequate understanding of their uses or their interpretation or the actual ways those tests are to be used.
Why do you say that?
Well, first, the whole issue we talked about before about the summary scales on the TSI, not actually even knowing or not using the TSI-2, the interpretation of the TSI to try to diagnose borderline, all indicate a lack of adequate understanding of that inventory, not understanding all the supplemental scales and how to approach those, to use those, this floating profile. These are pretty outdated, and it doesn't take long to find that out, that there is no longer a floating profile or things like that. Those all indicate a lack of understanding of that test. I have no doubt about her understanding of the achievement or the IQ test, those, other than why they were used, but and her explanation of even the MCMI is questionable because it was clear from that test that borderline would not be a high priority issue. So that's one set. The other set is, as we did today, you have all these tests administered over a 2-year period by 3 different mental health professionals, including herself, that show a consistent pattern of anxiety, trauma. And so you can't throw that out. If you think there's another diagnosis, then that's fine and you need to explain it. If you don't agree with that, then somehow you have to explain in your diagnosis and your reasoning why all these things are indicating something and you're not doing it.
So let me ask you this then. Would it be appropriate to potentially diagnose somebody, given all these testing, to diagnose somebody with borderline personality without diagnosing anything with regard to anxiety?
Not really, because
Why not?
Thank you. First, the tests you administered yourself and others don't suggest borderline. I mean, even if you want to say that, well, a borderline person could answer this test, like the MMPI, in that way, but then the other tests show that's not likely. And then if you say, well, I don't want to believe that this person has some type of trauma, anxiety disorder, then how do you explain this? You can't ignore it. Then your job as a clinician or a diagnostician is to say, all these tests are consistent. So if I'm not going to somehow at least include an anxiety disorder, PTSD, I need to explain why and somehow be able from interviews, other sources, to say why this is showing up, not just that I don't believe it or it shouldn't be there. It is there. These are data. You have to then deal with it as part of your jigsaw puzzle and have to say why specifically you're not including it, or include that along with whatever else you find as well.
And these test results that are all consistent with anxiety type disorders, can they be used simply rather than say, well, they're not anxiety disorders, but this just supports borderline? Can you say that?
Unfortunately, people could say almost anything. It wouldn't be a valid statement to make because, again, at least relying on the test, you don't have support for borderline. So it is really hard to say that somebody has a personality disorder like borderline when the specific test that you administered or somebody administered doesn't give that at all. So the first thing you would do is you'd have to say, well, the test isn't valid. They lied or did other things. Well, then you look at the validity scales. Well, it doesn't show that. So you're back to, it doesn't make sense. Anytime you have something that does not make sense, no matter what it is, your job is to make sense of it, is to figure out how it goes in the jigsaw puzzle. You can't dismiss it. You have to come up with some kind of explanation. And sometimes that's a real challenge. But your job is to do that, is to find out from the interviews or the collateral sources or the person, him or herself, or the testing, how do these finally make sense? That's the job of a diagnostician, an evaluator.
Okay. Now, you understand that Dr. DeMarte spent some time speaking with Miss Arias, right?
Yes,
And you did not.
that's correct.
And she reviewed other documents that you did not
Correct.
about Miss Arias.
That's my understanding.
Okay. So how is it then, since you have not reviewed or spoken to Miss Arias, how is it that you can say this then about these tests, that they don't support borderline, or that borderline might not be an appropriate diagnosis, without also diagnosing anxiety?
The tests ultimately have to be put into context, which is why I can't diagnose her or anybody else without doing it. So the tests are, for lack of better words, give you guides, working hypotheses. Your interview is to clarify. Your records and history are to clarify and to build the context. So it is conceivable that something somewhere might indicate depression. And in your history you found out, yeah, the person was depressed because a family member died, but now they're past it. So, okay, now I understand why that scale is elevated and where to go from here. But that's still your job, is to put it together. When you do these tests, the first way you do it is almost exactly like we did it here. In other words, in our language, it's called blind. I don't know the person, I don't know the history, but this is what the tests tell me. Okay, now the job is to link it up with the others, but you can't ignore what the tests tell you. That's why you give them. And when you have patterns, which is somewhat unusual sometimes, that, I mean, I'd have to think for a while to come up with testing over 2 years with 3 different mental health professionals, completely different types of tests, and one that's given twice, that shows a consistent pattern, and then somehow need to explain that through your other things. I didn't do those other things. All I can tell you is you have a pattern in those results that somehow need to be explained and can't be ignored.
And if you were actually doing an evaluation of Miss Arias, if you were had a working hypothesis for Miss Arias, for a diagnosis of some sort, what would your working hypothesis be based on these tests?
Based on these tests, I would need to...
Sustained.
May we approach?
You may.
All right, so if you were doing an evaluation, Dr. Geffner, of Miss Arias, and based on just this testing alone, we understand that you haven't interviewed or done anything else yet, but just based on these objective tests, what type of working hypothesis would you be looking at?
I would be looking at anxiety disorder, PTSD, and trying to find out what potential traumas may have occurred either currently or in the past, what types of things are going on that would produce those types of symptoms, and try to define and get more clarification on what these are related to, especially on the PDS. That at least gives you an indicator of identified stressors. I'd want to know a lot more information about those and a lot more explanation, and likely from an interview and then from collateral sources, from families, from others. That would be the steps.
All right. All right, thank you very much. No further questions.
Cross-examination.
Sir, one of the things that, could do that. Sir, one of the things that you told us was that you're licensed in California, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you also indicated that you were licensed in Texas, right?
I still am.
So the answer is yes, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you're not licensed in the state of Arizona, are you?
No, sir.
And you're not licensed in the state of Hawaii, right?
Correct.
And you've testified in Hawaii, haven't you?
Yes, sir.
And you're also not licensed in the state of Tennessee, right?
Yes, sir. I mean, correct.
And in fact, in the state of Tennessee, you testified in a case involving two individuals with the last name of O'Rourke, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
And in that particular case, sir, isn't it true?
Approach.
Overruled. Sir, you testified in the O'Rourke case, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
And that was in Tennessee, wasn't it?
Yes, sir.
And in fact, that's the case where the trial court found that you were nothing more than a hired gun, right?
That is what the judge stated.
That's right, at the trial court level, not that at the appellate level, right?
That is correct.
And in fact, he had some other choice words about your testimony, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
And in fact,
Objection, relevance, specific details.
And in fact, he indicated, that judge where you testified indicated that your testimony was completely without merit, right?
I believe something of those facts.
Do you want to take a look at this opinion?
That would be fine. I don't
Sure,
remember his
let's do
exact words, but yes, that would be fine.
Sir, take a look at page 13 of the opinion. It's head note number 18. Why don't you read it to yourself? When you're done reading it, let me know.
Yes.
If I may have it now.
Oh, okay. Instead, if you ask me more, I have to look at it again.
Isn't it true, sir, that the trial court found that your testimony in that case was completely without merit, right?
Don't remember now if he said completely, but yes, generally, that's true.
No, not generally. Isn't it true that the court said his testimony was completely without merit? Yes or no? Take a look at it again, 648.
Yes, sir, that is accurate.
And in fact, sir, in that particular case, in the O'Rourke case, you gave an opinion. You were hired by the mother, weren't you?
Yes, I was. Or, well, her attorney.
But you were hired on behalf of the mother, right?
Yes, sir.
It was a child custody dispute, right?
Yes, sir.
And you gave an opinion in that case without speaking to the father, didn't you?
I gave some opinions, yes.
Sir, well, let's take a look at the opinion about what it says. I want you to take a look at page 5. I want you to read it. And then also take a look at the top of page 6 and see what it says.
Did you say the bottom of page 5?
No, page 5 and then the top of page 6.
You talk about two different cases here. Are you asking me about this case or another case?
I'm asking you about that case. Take a look at it.
Okay, because page 6 you just told me to read is about another case.
Where you testified, correct?
Yes, so I'm a little confused, so.
Well, why don't you read the first part, and then we'll go over that. Because the second part talks about a Texas case where you testified, correct?
No, sir.
The Hawaii case where you testified?
That would be Hawaii, not Texas.
Go ahead. Read the first part.
Okay, just to clarify, are you
Read.
asking me to read page 5?
Go ahead and read page 5, yes.
Okay, yes, sir. And if you can refresh and tell me what your question was?
Are you done reading it is the question.
Well, I read the paragraph
Yes or no?
about... Yes, sir.
Let me have it back. In that case, sir, isn't it true that in your assistance of the mother, you provided an opinion with regard to whatever the issues were involving the children without talking to the father, right?
Yes,
And in fact, you also and in this case, the opinion is back in 2010, right?
no, sir.
Well, sir, why don't you just take a look at...
That was, the case was before
Sir,
that.
take a look at exhibit number 648, the opinion. What's the date of that opinion? The very top.
The opinion is dated November 10th.
So take a look at it, sir. Just take a look at it.
I did.
All right, if I may have it back.
Yes, sir.
What's the date of the opinion?
The opinion is dated November 2010.
So it is 2010, then, right?
You asked when I testified. I didn't testify, I believe, in
Sir,
2010.
the opinion is dated 2010, correct?
Yes, sir.
You testified in February of a couple years previous to that, correct?
That is correct.
You also were involved in a case in Texas involving an individual by the name of Clark, correct?
Evidently, I don't recall that case, but I know that I did according to the records.
Isn't it true that with regard to that particular individual, you submitted an affidavit, right?
I did.
And in fact, the trial court at that level found that your affidavit lacked credibility. Isn't that what it says?
Evidently.
Do you need to look at this to have
No,
your...
I didn't know it at the time that I submitted an
I'm not
affidavit.
asking at the time. I'm asking as you sit here today.
Yes, sir.
Isn't it true that you know that the trial court found in the Clark case that you submitted paperwork that lacked credibility, right?
Yes, that was the term.
At that time, when you submitted that affidavit that the court found to lack credibility, you had a number of years' experience as a psychologist, right?
Yes, sir.
You had numbers of years as a neuropsychologist, right?
Yes, sir.
You had a plethora of experience, right?
Yes, sir.
And in fact, even though you had that experience, the court found that you were making things up, right?
Objection to state's opinion.
No,
Making things up, right?
no, the court did not state that at all.
Well, isn't it indicated here that with regard to you, you submitted an affidavit and you talked about things that had happened 5 years prior to the events in question, right?
That's correct.
And you didn't review any court records or transcripts of the trial testimony, and yet you still submitted the affidavit, right?
That is correct.
And what you did rely is you relied on some records out of Pennsylvania, and those were from 1976, weren't they?
I believe that's correct.
And in fact, the conduct that you were looking at, you submitted this in 1992, right?
That part I don't remember. I'd have to look.
And-
If it says that, I'm not going to argue. I just don't remember.
And in fact, this was based on hearsay that was provided by other people, right?
Yes, sir.
You had the same sort of experience in Hawaii, didn't you?
Well, that's, you're going to have to be more specific about the same sort of experience. No, the Hawaii court didn't say I wasn't credible.
Well, the court in Hawaii excluded your testimony, didn't it? In the case involving Hawaii versus French, didn't they?
They excluded one small part of the testimony, not the rest.
So they did exclude part of your testimony, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
And sir, you indicated that, well, when you came in here, that you have worked, haven't ever worked with the defendant in this case, right?
Correct.
You indicated that you haven't worked with the prosecution, right?
Correct.
But you do know Alice Laviolette, right?
Yes, sir.
And in fact, you have been the editor of one of her publications, right?
The book I mentioned, yes.
And so you do have some association with her. You do talk to her, correct?
Yes, sir.
You have talked to her in the past, right?
Yes, sir.
And in fact, your colleagues, correct?
Yes, sir.
And one of the things you also indicated in this case was that you're doing this out of the goodness of your heart, this particular case, right?
No, I never use such terms.
Well, you said that with regard to this case, the only amounts that you're getting paid are your salary, right?
That is correct in all cases.
You're not getting any more money out of this case other than the payments that you get as part of your salary, right?
That is correct.
That nobody is paying you any money for this, right?
Yes, sir.
Even though you're not getting any money for this particular case, sir, you're still the same individual who will go to court if you believe in something and make things up, right?
Objection. Argumentative.
Sustained. Granted. The jury will disregard.
And sir, even without getting paid, you will come into cases like this, right?
When asked, yes.
And in fact, in this particular case, you told me that you were contacted last week sometime, right? About testifying in this case, right?
Well, that's partially what I said. I was
Well-
contacted long before. I didn't know till about a week and a half ago that I was actually going to be testifying.
You were contacted in this case with regard to an issue involving this case, what, January of last year? Is that when you were contacted?
No, November.
Of last year.
Yes, sir.
And then, after that, whatever issue that was, that issue was dealt with, correct?
Yes, sir.
And in terms of coming in here and testifying about and criticizing Janine DeMarte's work, you were contacted less than a week ago, right?
No, sir.
Is it 2 weeks ago?
No, unless you want to keep guessing, I can just tell you.
Well, sir, didn't you and I have an interview?
Yes, sir.
And didn't you, and we had that on Monday, didn't we?
Yes, sir.
Right?
Yes, sir.
At that time, I asked you, when was it that you had been contacted?